I'm going to unmute. We're going to get started. Linda, I want to be sure haven't lost you yet. We are recording. This is Basics of Involving Volunteers in CCE. This is Kim Fleming, Professional Development Specialist with Extension Administration. And I'm joined here with Linda Tripp. Are you there, Linda? Gotta make sure you're back. Do I need to unmute you, Linda? Possibly.
Mute me.
Okay, I unmuted you.
Okay, so this is Linda Tripp, 4-H issue leader for Cornell Cooperative Extension in Columbia and Greene counties.
All right, and I want to thank Linda for the presentation. This is something we've done a version of over a couple different years, and Linda joined in and added some great pieces to it. This is the basic. We're going to get it done in an hour or less, and just give you a general introduction. So whether you're new to volunteer management or not, we want to be sure the basics are out there for everyone. And if you have questions, we're happy to answer those as we go along. So everyone should be able to use chat. It's a button down on your menu. You can just click on chat. I think it might be over on the left-hand side as a viewer. I guess that depends. And then you can you can chat to everyone, or you may chat to, I believe it's presenters or host. So I want to be sure people can see that. And I'm also curious, we didn't do a poll. So I'm going to ask, how long have you worked with volunteers in CCE? So I'm putting that in the chat box. And good, seems to be working for Katie at least. There's not we've got a growing list here. Or Linda, are you going to put yours in?
Oh, sure. I can put mine in.
So we've got a 6-month, we've got a 2-year. Justin's in his first year working with volunteers. 29 for Linda. And I think we started just about the same time, Linda.
Yeah.
I was in Cayuga County 4-H Youth Development. All right. I'll also say that Jamie Ferris is on the line. Jamie, are you able to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone.
I know you're the silent partner today, but we want you to chime in as needed.
Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you're participating in this. Kim and Linda are going to do a terrific job. I'm very confident.
And Jamie's on a couple of the webinars coming up. We're going to be sharing shortly. But he's joining in today to chime in as needed and share some of his expertise. And Jamie is president of the Wood office, so your risk management agency for the associations. So Jamie works closely on a lot of this with us. So we welcome your involvement, Jamie. Okay, looks like we've got some new people. First year, 6 months. Somebody privately said too long. Very clever. Should be seeing the slide, the basics of involving volunteers. And Linda, I think I'm going to be forwarding that for us. So as you're talking, just let me know. We can click ahead with that. All right. And I'm also going to ask in the chat box, worked with volunteers overseas, America. Oh, great. Good. So we, Linda and I have worked for Extension for quite a long time. As I said, I started as a 4-H youth development educator in Cayuga County, and then was also in the state 4-H office. And in 2010, about, what is this year? 6-7 years ago, I started working with all of Extension administration with volunteer involvement and also professional development. So this is a piece of what I do now, really appreciate the connecting live. Love to connect face-to-face also, but I think webinar is a nice way to connect and not have people have to travel and meet up with us. We also have a lot of resources online. So so we will get rolling with this. If you all set, Linda?
I am all set.
Okay, fantastic. As you can tell, we're in 2 different locations, actually 3 with Jamie. And I also have Celeste Carmichael here with me listening in, who's been working on a special project, and we can talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Welcome, Celeste.
Thank you.
She's the peanut gallery in the back of the room, actually. She's trying to do her best to be quiet, though. Our agenda, again, keeping it basic, is really what our purpose today is, to provide that base for extension staff who manage volunteers. I want to be sure we're all on the same page, make sure any of the changes that may have occurred over the last year or the last couple of years have been picked up by each association. We do emailing, we have web pages, so there's different ways to connect, and we know that you're all managing volunteers. So just want to be sure and do a check-in. We're going to cover some basic volunteer terminology. We're also going to talk about the Achieving Success Through Volunteers philosophy for managing volunteers. So kind of get to that basic, how do we do this? What's the best way of managing volunteers? We're also going to talk about isoture, that I know those of you who have been in extension a while understand what that is. But again, we'll get into some of those basics and then talk about the volunteer involvement policy, the process, and some of the template forms that are there for you to use. So again, chime into the chat box anytime you want, and we'll keep an eye out for your questions. So we get a little, we know we have some new people here in the, let's make sure that clicks. There we go. Should be on the Getting to Know You page. It looks like we've got an AmeriCorps volunteer, so some more experience. What other experience do you have before you came to Cornell Cooperative Extension? So if you could put that in the chat box to everyone and share what experience you have. Maybe it was volunteering, maybe it's managing volunteers in another organization. So we'll have you put that right in the chat box and let us know. We know we've got some new people. All right, thank you, Flip. Managing 100 volunteers at a food pantry in Western Massachusetts. And we have a 4-H volunteer on the line too. That's good experience for sure. Teaching at public schools, great. Parents volunteering for activities, great. Juliana's working with rural extension with farmer associations. Great. So Linda, we could probably just shut right down and walk away now, shall we?
I think, yeah.
All right. But as we know, Cooperative Extension has its own little our way of doing things and our policies. So appreciate you can keep typing that right in. So it looks like we've got some great experience with volunteers. So some of the things we're talking about will be familiar, but we will get into a little bit more specific about the volunteer involvement policy. So anything else we need to know? I'm also wondering, I mentioned isoture in the introduction. Have people heard about isoture? Is that a new term for folks? Just to get a feel. So new terms, never heard of it, new to me. Okay.
Oh, excellent.
All right.
We'll have some fun today.
Okay, we will. Thank you for the interaction in the, and we've got some also familiar. So, so what we hope to do is to, this is me, right, Linda? Sorry.
Yep. Did you skip the the website screenshot?
Did I jump ahead? I did. Sorry. So we, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the volunteer involvement policy, and this is a page on the staff page for Cornell Cooperative Extension. It's on the staff.cce.cornell.edu page, and it's under the units of organizational development. And this is just a clip from that page that talks about the volunteer involvement policy. And what we've done is sorted some of the resources under the policy and implementation, including a screening memo about the policy. We also have volunteer selection and assignment. So some of the, what's the screening all about? What's some of the paperwork that the volunteer has to work on? The actual application is there. I thought I clicked the short form in there. I may have to do something else to make that happen.
Yeah.
Volunteer orientation topics are there, and these are very important, especially for risk management. There's a simple checklist and also a little more detail. So these topics inform what you do as an orientation right now in the associations. We also have supervision and evaluation, what to do when there's a challenge with a volunteer, how to work through concern about a volunteer's performance or a complaint from a volunteer. Little guidance in that area, and also documenting volunteers, so tracking all the requirements we have with the policy, tracking volunteers there. We'll go into more details through the presentation, but these are just some of the resources that are available on the website.
Okay, now we're ready to move on, and always it's good to start at the very beginning. I know that we have a lot of people who have experience either as being a volunteer themselves or working with volunteers, but it's important that we all are coming from the same base. And so defining our Cooperative Extension Association volunteer is important. Who are we specifically talking about? And we're talking about someone who perform services for our association. And that means they're not only a program participant, that they're more than that, and that they will be following Cornell policy. Board members who are also volunteers have County Law 224 that they're following, looking at our association constitution and any of our Cornell rules. So, for example, this is one that came up in our association a few years ago. We had one of our staff people who was providing a training on stream monitoring for individuals in the community. So the expectation is that these people would be volunteering as stream monitors at some point. But the question was then, because she was training these people to become volunteers, were they our CCE association volunteers, or were they going to be somebody else's volunteers? And in the end, she was providing the training, but none of them were going to be doing stream monitoring for us at that point anyway. So they would not be our volunteers. She did not have to have them complete any kind of a volunteer application or anything like that. So indeed, at that point, they were program participants. And the other thing with our association volunteers is, if you think back to the previous slide, we have our volunteer involvement policy that we're going to be talking about. And that is something that is specific to Cornell Cooperative Extension, our own volunteer involvement policy. And so volunteers for our associations do need to fulfill what that says. For Cornell Cooperative Extension, individuals who are 18 years and older can sign a volunteer agreement. They fill out the application. They do all the kinds of things that our volunteers need to do. If we have younger than 18 years old, then those people who want to volunteer would be enrolled as 4-H club members, 4-H members. And that's how they would be volunteering, is through their enrollment in 4-H. Correct with that? Am I?
You are correct with that.
Okay. Want to make sure on that. And yeah, so so basically anyone can volunteer, but they do need to fulfill the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about next, as far as if they're going to be enrolled volunteers or casual volunteers. You can switch to the page.
Okay. Maybe.
Okay. So probably one of the most important things we as staff need to remember is that volunteers serve at the discretion of our CCE association. It's a privilege to volunteer for us. And one of the things that I believe, well, at least through 4-H anyway, that sometimes we as staff get caught up in is trying to do anything to keep a volunteer, and even more so to keep a volunteer happy. And sometimes that can be at the detriment of the other volunteers who are involved in our program or our program itself. So try not to get caught up in that. And do keep in mind that either the volunteer supervisor or the volunteer themselves can end an agreement at any time. So it's not like someone, if they sign up to be a volunteer, that they need to complete their year or 2 years or anything like that. This is really at will. So look in your, type into your chat, what would be some reasons that an association may want to discontinue service of a volunteer? What do you think? And this is not an easy thing to do. Over my years, I've had to do this a few times, and sometimes you have volunteers who really just don't want to leave, even though you need them to. Any ideas?
I'm looking for some broad reasons. There we go.
Unacceptable behavior. Yep. Like discrimination, isn't following through on obligations, or can't make the time commitment. Yep. That's probably one of the easiest ones to talk about. Aggressive behavior, not being a good role model. Unreliable, not following policy, misconduct. Okay, their goals as a volunteer don't match what we're looking for. The easiest one there, Catherine, is the project is finished. So there's no more volunteering to be done, in particular with that project. And so I think you've hit several, probably all of them, not that we had thought of: not following the code of conduct, compromises the health or safety of the participants, mismanagement of public funds. That's probably the easiest to deal with if you just don't provide opportunities for volunteers to have easy access to funds. And we've really set that up through cooperative extension, in that any of our volunteer groups, really their funds should be in our association coffers. So that should make that easier. Conflict of interest sometimes happens. And sometimes you're going to have a volunteer. Do any of you have one like this that takes up a lot of your time? It really compromises your effectiveness to work, because it just takes them a lot to keep them quote unquote happy, or that they need a lot of support to do the job that they do. So yes, there's all kinds of reasons we may want to try to think about having a volunteer leave. And something to keep in mind coming up is Kim's coming next week webinar on June 8th at 2, and that's Tender Care of the Challenging Volunteer. Even if you don't have or don't think you have a challenging volunteer right now, it's going to happen sooner or later. So really try to get into this webinar next week, June 8th at 2. And it really is helping you to see how you can set up for volunteer success and management, and then also how to sometimes transition a volunteer when challenges or conflicts arise. So we're not going to be dealing with this anymore today, but next week will be a perfect time. And Kim, are these also taped so that they're available on that website you just showed us?
That's right. We're recording right now, so if all goes well, we'll have a recording of this presentation and then plan to do the other ones also. We do have some recordings from past webinars, but I think the latest is better. Spend your time on the latest recording.
Let's see, what is Lexi saying here? She manages over 70 college volunteers, and they're the backbone of our program, but also take more time than the families that we work with. Well, especially with that group, when you have a lot of young people, definitely some of them probably have more experience volunteering than others, so they may need more support just to know what to do as a volunteer. So I can see that, Lexi.
And Linda, it might make sense here to clarify. So volunteers do take a lot of time. We're talking about the ones that take the excessive amount, that are always in your office, always maybe complaining about the work or other people, or just getting themselves in trouble more than they should be. So that excessive
oh, definitely,
really
definitely, because you cannot think that or even imagine that having volunteers is not going to take any time, because just like anybody, any staff person that you might manage, they need your support. They need to totally understand what their job is, and they need to have follow-up and oversight. So definitely working with volunteers does take time, but it really does make a difference in most all of our programs as far as what our reach can be, or even what kind of knowledge we're able to share with our constituents. Because I can tell you for sure, there's no way that I could share what some of our volunteers' knowledge and background is.
Absolutely.
Okay, shall we move on to categories?
Sure.
Okay, so we're just going to review a little bit more terminology that you will see when you read the VIP program. And we do have in Cooperative Extension 3 general categories, as you can see here. We have the casual volunteer, and definitely that's our short-term volunteer. It might be a day, it might be several days, but not a continuous kind of a program. And these volunteers always need to be supervised either by a staff person or by an enrolled volunteer. So someone is with them at all times. That is either a staff person or an enrolled volunteer. The short-term volunteer is not subject to the same screening and selection policies of the long-term volunteer that we're going to talk about in a little bit. This person will need a criminal background check if they are working with us for more than one day, and definitely if they're working with children. They will need to complete an acknowledgement of risk form, and we'll want to collect some general information from them, and that's the casual form that Kim is going to make sure is up on the website there. So that's what a casual volunteer is. Now,
Sorry, Linda.
Yeah? Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Nope, I just clicked something.
Okay. And so put into the chat, what are some types of things that your casual volunteers might be doing?
Or what kind of casual volunteers do you have?
Yeah, what kind of? Okay, helping at a one-off fundraiser. Yep, so they're helping for one time. I would say for our 4-H staff out there listening that you may have casual volunteers judging at your fair, for example. Yep, public presentation judges, helping with the 4-H club, but they're not the organizational leader person that's there every time. Providing educational sessions for 4-H or even for any programs that we're doing. Exactly. So those are casual volunteers. Every association has elected volunteers, and those are our board of directors, okay? And these days, I believe that that's the only elected volunteers we have across the state are our board of directors. These volunteers, they need to follow our New York County Law 224 and our association constitution. And they are not specifically supervised by staff like our other volunteers are. We do, from the state level, do encourage associations to have the board of directors vote that all board members undergo a criminal background check. Now, that's not required, and probably many of your associations already do that. I know that ours does. Okay, then we have the enrolled volunteer. Now, this is the volunteer that often it volunteers for a year-long, not every day, obviously, but definitely it's a long-term, maybe longer than a year, or they're working with our higher risk populations. This group of volunteers is not always supervised by a staff person, and that's why we do a lot more work in their enrollment as a volunteer. This volunteer, we provide a position description, they complete an application, that includes their listing of 2 references that we follow up with and get their feedback. We talk with them, we interview them, we conduct for sure criminal background check. They have to sign an acknowledgement of risk form and volunteer agreement, which includes a code of conduct. So there's a lot more that we do with an enrolled volunteer. But on the other hand, this person then is able to provide programs that there is not always a staff person there. One thing I like to throw in here, though, is that if this enrolled volunteer is working with youth, we always want to have at least one other adult with them, be it another enrolled volunteer or casual volunteer, because it's always better to have 2 adults whenever there are children involved. Another type of enrolled volunteer would be our master gardener volunteer. I believe that they all, I know in our association they all go through the same process so that they're ready to be able to teach a program alone or be at a farmer's market alone or any of those kinds of things. So for sure, those are the 2. And definitely any of our overnight chaperones for any of our youth program trips. They're working with a higher risk and they're many times unsupervised and working with the kids. So our overnight chaperones are definitely enrolled volunteers as well. Okay, so there you go. Have you heard those 3 or seen those 3 descriptions of types of volunteers in CCE before? Let me know in the chat if they are familiar with you. Okay, good. So many of you have at least heard of these 3 categories. So that's great. And that's why we're doing this training, is because not all organizations have descriptions like these 3. So this is very specific to Cornell Cooperative Extension. And I'm glad to see even if you're really new to us, you may not have heard of all these before, but now you're getting them. So that's really important.
And Linda, I just want to jump in here. Catherine Benatovich had talked about kind of that supervising volunteer, and Catherine, I'm not sure if that went to everybody. I think it did. So you were suggesting, Catherine, that a few of the lead volunteers suggested they act as the go-between to free up our time to work on all areas of programming. Do you want to share a little bit of detail about that? We want to be sure that we're clear on staff supervision and that sort of thing. So tell us a little bit more, Catherine, maybe in the chat.
I think about, if I hear the word supervising volunteer, that also makes me think of like our 4-H clubs, their organizational leader. Mm-hmm. The person, because they're really a supervisor in a way of the other volunteers in the club, because they're helping to orchestrate who's going to be teaching what, who's going to be helping the kids plan a community service activity, those kinds of things.
Okay, and it looks like Catherine is also talking about 4 volunteers who act as coordinators for districts. So it used to be called the district coordinators. We've heard area reps, yep. I think in 4-H sometimes also. And I just think it's important they're supervising volunteers at a certain level, but also understand that the educator, this is great. Thank you, Catherine.
Yep. Excellent.
Just understand that obviously these staff are also supervised by, these volunteers are supervised by staff and need to be sure that they're, talking with staff and not just running programs on their own. I don't know, Jamie, if you had something else you wanted to add to that comment, the supervising volunteer?
I just wanted to make sure that was clear, that even a supervising volunteer stands, quote unquote, below the educator, or the staff is always overall in charge of a situation. So we want to make sure there's always clear lines of communication and command so to speak, with every event or however people are in charge. It's obviously we want people to be engaged. We want people to be given responsibility when it's appropriate for them to have it, but it's also clear that they understand that who they defer to when it comes to certain questions of authority.
I think that also brings up orientation and training, and those volunteers having that experience, being sure they are well-versed in all the risk management policies and just program implementation in general. So thank you, Jamie. Thanks for adding that in.
And Lexi just mentioned about her program with the college students, and definitely I think she fits the model there, where the students, the college students are teaching the programs, but the staff person is there supervising. And she says that she sometimes feels like she's the principal of a school, but she's there with them as they're doing their teaching, but they plan their programs and work with her in making sure they're fine. So that makes a lot of sense.
All right, great. Appreciate it. And thank you, Catherine. Yeah. It's gone through the lines of communications first with expectations also. So again, more on that if you want to join in on the tender care of the challenging volunteer, more on the lines of communication and being prepared for really setting up any event for success. So supervising volunteers, and all volunteers know who's in charge and also what to do if there's an emergency, those sort of things. So great, appreciate these examples. They're really, really adding.
Exactly. Okay, let's go on to philosophy and isoture, and Kim, you can jump on that.
Okay, this is the real fun stuff. Not always, but sometimes. So just to kind of get in your minds, we're not going to spend a lot of time on philosophy. But we do want to just take everybody back kind of to the basics and think about we're sure we're not just recruiting volunteers and putting them to work. There's so much more to involving volunteers in Cornell Cooperative Extension. And all of you on here, if you are attending the webinars, I know that you're also paying attention to policy and what we need to do. But just a good reminder for everybody is to think about how we take care of volunteers, how we involve volunteers. And we know that volunteers are out there in the community. They're representing us. They're leading our programs. They're a great connection to all of the participants on our program. And we're going to use this document from Michigan State, actually, Achieving Success Through Volunteers. About 5 years ago, we did a regional training, and this was shared with each association, and we understand that with turnover, this may not be able to be found, and we'll have other resources that come up, but this was a nice base of working through volunteers and thinking through the whole isoture philosophy. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the basic is there's really benefits to having that consistent volunteer management and development program. So we'll talk more as we go through, but this is introducing you to that. And the benefits are that it does build identity. And when we talk about a volunteer management system, we're talking about beyond the 4-H program. This includes your master gardeners. This includes volunteers that are helping in the office. This might be volunteers that are working in your forestry It could be, there's all kinds of volunteers that are out there, but really thinking about that whole volunteer management system for the association, or maybe even for the region. We've had some big success with some regional volunteer programs, building identity together. And really, as we think about volunteers statewide through Cornell Cooperative Extension, if everyone understands this organization, there's going to be a wonderful identity there across the state for volunteers who do step up to really help out and make the programs of Cornell Cooperative Extension. So a volunteer management system can also secure resources. We've got so many volunteers in this association. We need some support to make that happen. So it's a big feature in your community that might also bring in the human resources and also the financial resources as it's looked at as a one big happy volunteer management system. Also facilitates communication, and we always have to think about that. Again, if it's just the 4-H program educator who's running the volunteer program, or the 4-H volunteer, and there's other volunteers out there, we know you've got boards, we know you have program committees or issue committees. let's make sure that communication is consistent. As volunteers step up to help with cooperative extension in your association, they're going through one process, one system to get signed up, to get to apply, to be sure they're attending the right orientation. Again, just think system-wide and think statewide. The more consistency we have, the easier it is to administer your volunteer programs. Also improves the effectiveness of the program. So just quick idea about that volunteer management system. And then some of those basic components that we really want to have in a volunteer management plan. This helps to guide the organization, is to think about the needs that you have for individual volunteers in your association or your region if you're thinking bigger. Think about needs for groups, and also think about needs for the program. There may be people that come to you and want to, say, lead a guiding eye program, or do something that's just not what cooperative extension wants to do, doesn't really fit into that mission. So really think clearly about the volunteers that you need, and be proactive about who you're bringing into the association to help sign up for that. Make sure you have the resources, the financial and the human resources, to manage the volunteers that you're bringing in. Another crucial component of the volunteer management plan is to actually have a type of implementation plan. How you're going to, once you recruit those volunteers, how you're going to put them to work, get them involved in meaningful ways in the association, helping them to really set realistic and appropriate goals to further the programs of cooperative extension. And then a way to evaluate the program, also evaluate the volunteer experience. And then obviously with volunteers and participants, we want to make sure there's a recognition piece. So these are just 5 very basic components that might be in your volunteer, or should be in your volunteer management plan. There may be more, there may be different ways you look at them, but the crucial ones are making sure we understand the needs, we can get the resources we need to make it happen, we have some way to implement involving those volunteers, evaluating the volunteers, and also recognizing. Let's see a question that came in there. So volunteer, I see a question. Oh, am I following? Let's see. Make sure I'm hitting the right place. Are you following that, Linda? Okay.
Okay.
Volunteer training, including in the volunteer training included in the orientation for new staff. So when we talk about ISATUR, this is a question that came in privately. When we talk about ISATUR, we talk about the O is orientation and the T is for training. Really 2 different things. So when we talk about orientation, getting that volunteer up to speed with the organization, with their role, might involve youth and adults development training, and then, or orientation, I should say, making sure that there's an understanding with that. And then more training beyond that would be that next step. So I look at the 2 as 2 different things, making sure they understand the role, understand their expectations, understand also a little bit about the organization and how we develop youth, how we work with adult learners. And then beyond that might be what comes after that initial orientation. So it could be training in content like the Master Gardener training. It could be understanding more about youth development, or what are the events in the youth development program. It could also be building on orientation. And Linda has she's done a lot with working with volunteers as far as orientation, and also taking it up to that next level. And that's the piece I see as training, just to answer that question.
Exactly.
And another comment here from Catherine, I think people can see that volunteers, if volunteers don't feel supported, that's where the problems arise, definitely. We want to recognize what they're doing, and that we want them to be doing what they're doing, that they're following expectations and values. So Catherine's asked for tips or checks being used. Any tips or checks being used in our group here today? So are there other on the line who have ways to recognize those volunteers? I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, and Lexi has a good comment, and really it is about being very clear about what decisions are made at the volunteer level, and what parameters they can work within. And I see where sometimes this is kind of goes awry, is especially in the 4-H club program. when we have staff leave and we have that void for a little while, but we still have a volunteer, let's say, livestock committee or a volunteer dairy committee, and the staff that are left are like, would you guys just please keep things moving? Put together a clinic for the summer and let me know what you're planning, or those kinds of things. And sometimes that means that we may be asking our volunteers to take on more responsibility without a whole lot of guidance. And some volunteers love that and may be not real happy to give up that freedom and ability to make decisions when a new staff person comes in. So I think that is a key place where we have to be careful.
Okay. And there's also this question here about the sample or outline volunteer management plan, and that's exactly what ISACHR is, and Linda's going to talk about that next.
Okay.
So, thank you for your questions and suggestions. That's fantastic.
Okay, so the kinds of things that Kim just talked about are very evident in the popular ISACHR, as we call it, leadership development theory. This started as a leadership development theory in 1969 by Dr. Robert Dolan at North Carolina State. And it was introduced to Extension in 1971. Our CCE Association VIPP is based on this ISACHR theory, volunteer development. Now, let's see what you know about ISACHR. So type into the chat box this is an acronym, okay? So I is the first letter of a word, S is the first letter of the next word, but it is listed in the order of the kinds of things that are involved with volunteer management. And what do you know? Even if you don't know all of them, do you know what, put into the chat box, at least what some of those letters stand for as far as volunteer management goes? Okay, selection, that is a good one. So far, you guys are really trying hard. Evaluation, yep. Orientation, identify, yep. Training, yes. You're doing good. Most of those are on point. The ones that were not are close. Okay, let's go up to the next one. What does ISACHR really stand for? Switch the slide, there you go. So as you can see, identify, select, orient, train, utilize, recognize, and evaluate are all very important, and all parts of this. Now we are going to finish up our last 15 or so minutes here, really looking at the first four of those: identify, select, orient, and train. And so I think what we're going to do here is move on to the next slide. Nope, not that part. There you go. So identify. So in the chat box, please type in there, what does a volunteer manager do in this step of volunteer management? So when we are identifying, what are we doing? Finding and recruiting, determining what the role of the volunteer is and who the potential volunteers may be, determining the needs of the program. Very good. You guys are really on point there. Well, look at the next slide.
Got it.
Okay. And yes, number one, we're identifying the need for a volunteer in a specific position. And along with that, once you've decided what are your needs, what do you need help doing, then you need to put together a position description that will target and tell us what qualifications you're looking for, what the expectations of the position are, and what the volunteer would be doing. And luckily, we have a number of samples of these position descriptions on the website. So you don't have to start from point zero. Most of us will find position descriptions that we can use right from that list with just a little bit of localization. So definitely look there when you're putting together your position descriptions.
And Linda, there's a comment that came in privately, which I think fits here also, is identifying which volunteers are casual and which are long-term. So.
Definitely. And really thinking clearly about that and really considering who is long-term, who is not, who is working with, who do you need to be able to work independently without a staff person or an enrolled volunteer there with them. You really need to think those through very clearly. So yes, and then of course, looking to see where you can find some potential volunteers. And so that's part of it as well. So the next slide gives an example of what a volunteer position description might look like. And you can see there the parts of it, the purpose, the responsibilities, expected results, meaning, how will the volunteer know that they've done their job, what kind of support is available, how often do they report, what the time commitment might be. I think that's really important for many, as well as qualifications. And a couple things that are not on this particular example. You may want to also put in there who the supervisor's name is in the contact, okay? What kinds of screenings would need to be done for this volunteer position, and also along with that, what category does this fit into, casual, enrolled, or elected? May not be so meaningful to the prospective volunteer, but it will be helpful to you as you're keeping track of these. Okay.
All right. There's a great question in the box, and Catherine is asking how many extension educators here today have or how many associations have a volunteer manager, and this really is it's a great question, because we talk about volunteer managers like it's a full position in cooperative extension, and there's very few people who are managing volunteers in the system that do that full-time, Catherine. So when we talk about volunteer managers, we're talking about all the educators out there that work with volunteers at any extent, and quite often it's a percentage of your position, or a percentage of a couple different positions in an association. You may have a focus in one area, the other, like the 4-H youth development educator may work closely with volunteers in the 4-H program. The Master Gardener coordinator would work with Master Gardener volunteers. So there's a lot of associations that have maybe one person, or maybe 3 or 4, depending on how big the association is. It could be a big number, but very few, if there's any, that have total volunteer involvement responsibilities in their job. And then there also may be someone from the association who's been assigned to do that oversight role. And that's where the key comes in with that consistency. And it may be one of those other volunteer managers. But good question about how many have volunteer managers. They're out there, but it doesn't tend to be a full volunteer management position. And that's how we're using it. We're using it as anyone like you, Catherine, or who has even a piece of their position working with volunteers. And it's pretty tough, because I think another thing Isature brings to us is there's many different components and roles for managing a volunteer, from when we first tell them about Cornell Cooperative Extension right to the part where we're working with them regularly, communicating, recognizing, giving them feedback. So
yeah.
Good question. But don't let it overwhelm. There are lots of us out here to support you. I'm here also as a volunteer involvement specialist. There's wonderful educators like Linda with lots of experience, and actually there's several on the line also. So you can ask around your association, but also in your neighboring counties to get some guidance that way. Not that you're feeling overwhelmed, but your question, it's a good question for sure. So we are getting down there on time, so we'll quickly talk about selection. This is really a key piece of managing volunteers, and sometimes, unfortunately, it takes that it takes the focus, or it becomes the focus on an association of how we select the volunteers. And when I talk about selection, there's different pieces. Recruitment's part of that, but also the whole screening piece. And we do want to be sure that we spend some time on that. So I'm going to pause with it. You can think in your mind, what does a volunteer manager do in this step of orientation? But I'm also going to move ahead with the slides. If you want to chime into the box, you can feel free to do that. Think about what kind of things fall under selection. And I'm cheating because I'm jumping to the next slide without pausing there. Volunteers are recruited. It's when they're screened, when they're matched with their specific position. So that's really the definition of it, but it's also when they agree to the paperwork, when they sign off. This is my volunteer agreement. This is the code of conduct. I agree to follow that. They're really self-selecting at that point. And if they won't sign off on the volunteer agreement, then they're not going to become a volunteer for the volunteer involvement policy. So that whole big selection policy is you bringing, kind of onboarding that volunteer, bringing them in, getting them to participate and give you the information that's needed. It could also be the interview. So depends on the category. This is another piece with selection. With volunteer management philosophy, we want to think about, let's make this as a pleasant, worthwhile onboarding for the volunteer. And we know with the long term, those higher risk situations, maybe someone who's chaperoning, maybe somebody who's committing to a year with the program, we're going to really invest in an orientation, training. We're going to do that application. We're going to do the interviews. So with that enrolled volunteer, it's kind of a hyped up entry. We want to be sure we've got the right person there we're going to be working with throughout the year or part of the year, a bigger part of the year. They may be not always supervised by staff, so we really want to be sure we get the right people in. So we're also asking that we think about reference checks, really spending a little more time than when we would bring on that casual volunteer, where the selection might be fill out a short information form. So we've got your name, your number. We do need demographics. We also need emergency number, because we've had volunteers that have showed up the first day, help out an event, fainted, and we didn't have emergency numbers for them. So we're really pushing for that general contact information. Obviously, we'll want to send them mailings and have ways of getting in touch with them also. So again, selection depends on, are they casual, a little more short term? Will they always be supervised by staff? But either way, we're also going to think about that background screening. If they're volunteering for more than 1 year or 1 day per year, and they're a short-term, lower risk volunteer, we still want that minimum background screen. So that's a quick, we can move forward to that. Collecting applications and background checks are so crucial. If we have a volunteer who hasn't gone through a criminal background check, if they're volunteering for more than 1 day, I think most of you know this, then they really should not be coming back for that second day. And there's a lot of reason for this as far as managing risk in the program, protecting our participants, protecting the volunteer also, knowing if there is somebody coming in with some type of criminal background that we can screen for. Also, protecting the association. So if a volunteer has a criminal background, we haven't checked that, and something happens in the program, we definitely want to be able to say that we've checked this out, and not that the background screen will take care of everything. It does help to protect us all, and adds that level of volunteers sometimes also selecting out when they find out they have to fill one in. Mm-hmm. So it's application, background check, references, just making sure you're going through the whole volunteer involvement policy requirements, and then the matching of the skills and the clarifying expectations, especially the time commitment. So kind of falls into that a little bit more about the position description too, that would have been posted when you were recruiting. So we see some questions coming in. So is all of this still relevant for the casual one-time volunteer? Great question. So casual one-time, once a year, once a calendar year, Kaylin, that volunteer wouldn't have to go through the background check. You can decide the situation, and if you want to do that, obviously, but our minimum requirement statewide is the one-time volunteer once a year wouldn't have to be. wouldn't have to have a background screen, but you'd still want the information on that volunteer. You want that contact information. We need demographics for who we're working with. That's a federal requirement, and emergency contact is very crucial also. The one-time casual volunteer we're also assuming is always supervised by staff at any event. So good question on that one. Do counties bring on volunteers at any point during the year? Do you have an annual time to add new volunteers? Going as they arise can be hard. Also, don't want to lose someone that is interested. So that may be a question other people will want to answer for Kelly. Some of the programs are a little more structured. So with an enrolled volunteer in the 4-H program, there's a specific October 1st to October 1st is the 4-H year. So that I think it's a little easier to structure. But I think, Kelly, what you're saying is it's just tough having that recruiting going on, having the onboarding going on all year long. But sometimes
I think that especially if it's 4-H you're talking about, it really depends on you and your association and what you can accomplish. For example, in my situation here at Columbia Green, I tend to, I don't actively recruit new club leaders all year round, but definitely and so I recruit most in the fall, and that's where my largest number, don't think it's a lot, largest number like maybe 3 or 4 might be coming forward. But during the year, if someone does come forward, I will definitely not make them wait until fall, but get them while I can. But it depends on what works for you. Now, for our Master Gardener program, they have a set recruitment time, a set start time, and many hours of training. And so that only happens once a year or maybe once every other year.
Okay. Thanks, Linda. I should have just turned that right over to you. Awesome. Appreciate it.
The interesting one there about the crime.
Yes.
Let's see.
Flip from St. Lawrence County. Are there things that come back on the background check that would still not qualify?
You know what I've done? Because I have had a couple come back, and I really have gone to the person and told them that this is what came back. And in one particular case, it happened that it wasn't even that person. But when we went to and worked through the whole the background check company, and that it was the information was incorrect. So I would suggest that not trying to make that information not real, because it is, but to also bring it to the attention of the person, and that's a reason why you have to you have to disallow them from being a volunteer with us. But also they may say, well, I don't understand, and then they can definitely go to the background check company and see if it's actually true or not. So that's my suggestion there.
Yep, that's good. And we're talking about the First Advantage volunteer screening, which is a fairly basic screening. It's, what is it now, $9, $8, $9 per person. You can get a more detailed one, and you can actually go back to First Advantage and get something more detailed. But I think what Linda's saying is, if this is a volunteer, somebody, it's good to talk with the volunteer that this is happening. They'll also, I believe, get a copy of their screening. So they may see the same report, and it could be that it's the same name, same birthday. We had that before, and it was actually a man versus a woman with the same birthday. So something came up for this poor woman who had a background check. So the screening is not perfect, but it's good to work through the volunteer. But there also are crimes that come up that we wouldn't want that volunteer.
Right.
Yeah. We wouldn't allow that volunteer to be part of cooperative extension. That's up to the association, but we also have guidelines on the volunteer screening memo that's back on that first page with volunteer policies. So Jamie, I'm not sure if you're still with us, but we talk about felonies within the last 7 years might be an example of what would disqualify a potential volunteer.
We do have a question about volunteers not wanting to give their social security number. And what I have done, which has worked for some of my volunteers, is have them come into the office and they give me their number and I type it directly into the form online. So it doesn't have to be written down. It's not kept in a file anywhere here or anything like that. And I've also had some prospective volunteers who just do not volunteer for us because they refuse to do the whole thing.
All right, thanks, Linda. Another question here, enrolled volunteers working with youth. Is there any specific training we can offer or require to help them recognize issues such as drug abuse, sexual abuse, and to know how to handle their suspicions? One thing that concerns many is confidentiality if youth goes to them with issues. There's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of details in there. And again, I'm asking if Jamie's still on. As far as training with volunteers, I think that's probably getting into more detail than we're going to talk about today. We don't have, through Cooperative Extension, specific training like that, but if it's something that's needed in your association, we can talk about that directly if you want to just get in touch with me.
I'm on. Yes, that would be the appropriate contact through Kim, and then we can talk about what may or may can't be able to be done in a particular situation.
Yeah. And actually the same thing with the hit from a volunteer record. If there's some concern, it's great to involve Jamie Ferris or Karen Supek at the Wood office to work through some of that also.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm seeing more messages and we're getting really close on time.
Yep, so we better go. Was I talking about recruitment, I think?
Yes, you're next on recruitment. Okay,
Yep.
So you followed through the other ones. And we're, again, happy to take questions after the training too. So I'm available. You can call my number or send an email and we can get in touch to get into some more of these details.
Yes, I mentioned a few things about recruitment relating to one of the questions about when you might want to do that. And definitely some things to think about would be why volunteers are, why they want to volunteer, and that might affect what kind of a position that they might want to hold. Sometimes for me, if a volunteer says they want to be a 4-H club leader, but they don't have much time, I talk with them about what might be better for them than to start a club. And then if you are really pressing for certain kinds of volunteers, and I think at another time we're probably going to be able to talk more about broad-based and targeted, what's the difference between broad-based recruitment and targeted recruitment, and how you can really get your word out, and definitely trying to reach the underrepresented populations. So that's a whole nother area, this whole recruitment, but definitely it's part of what you do. Okay,
so I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about this meeting. Here's another page. This is the volunteer involvement and policy. This is actually the home page for volunteer involvement and a link to get to the volunteer involvement policy. Looks pretty similar to the policy page. It gives you some, again, philosophy, a little bit of values of volunteer, and it connects to a whole area of resources and webinars that fall under this. So as Linda's talking about volunteer recruitment and selection, you'll see at the bottom of the slide there, the CCE Pro, which is CCE Professional Development, 143, Retaining and Recruiting Diverse Volunteers. So we have webinars on these available. Many of the recordings are there. If they were done more recently, slide handouts are there to give some guidance on that also. And there's also resources working with more diverse audiences or underrepresented audiences. So again, we can guide you in that. Resources are there. That's basically what you need to know with that. And give me a call and we can spend some more time, or keep your eyes open for other webinars that are coming next. Anything else on that one, Linda?
Nope, not right now.
So we've referred to screening. I talked about it earlier, so this is kind of a repeat on that. But again, screening specified for enrolled versus casual volunteers is on this slide. So we get much more detailed with written position description application. 2 references is a minimum for that interview when you're bringing in that long-term volunteer who may be unsupervised or not supervised by staff all the time, like the organizational development leader. Interview, reference check, criminal background check. So I think we've talked about that. And then the motor vehicle record check. It's always a favorite one. If the volunteer is driving for Cornell Cooperative Extension, if they're doing something on behalf of Cornell Cooperative Extension, we want to be sure that they've gone through a motor vehicle record check. And that check can be done through the Wood office, can be done other places too, but the final report does need to go to Jamie Ferris in the Wood office. So that's if they're driving volunteers on it, or say youth to the state fair, or even if they're transporting some materials from one place to another on behalf of Cornell Cooperative Extension. We want to be sure that they've got a clean driving record, or we understand what their driving record is. And sometimes those volunteers will not be able to drive on behalf of us. And this isn't talking about when the volunteer's driving to the extension office to do something. That wouldn't be part of their volunteer role. But if they're transporting youth that way, then it would. So volunteer vehicle record check is very important if you haven't heard that. Also the volunteer agreement, the code of conduct, the acknowledgement of risk. And we haven't talked about the acknowledgement of risk yet. That's another form. It's a waiver form. It's available on this website, also in the form code 1501, which is the risk management guidance. This is basic, so we're trying to keep it that way, but there's the acknowledgement of risk form is probably a form that's been pulled out and customized for your association. It's also in the list of resources for this webinar, but this is very important, whether it's for enrolled or casual, to have that volunteer sign off on that risk waiver, and you can take a look at that. Screening for casual volunteers, again, if they're driving, they need the motor vehicle check. If they're volunteering for more than 1 day, the background check, and then that emergency contact, like information for the volunteer, code of conduct, and acknowledgement of risk. So that's screening really quickly, and feel free to put your questions in and we can follow up on those if you want to stay a little later. We're all caught up at the moment in chat, Linda?
Yeah. Okay,
anything else to add? That's a quick one.
Nope, you did good.
All right. And this sort of, this screening chart is also posted. We actually changed this over the weekend, or actually Thursday and Friday. Linda and I were taking a look at it, and I've had some questions about casual volunteers. Are they always just 1 day? And we realized this form was saying casual short-term 1 day / no overnight events, which was really confusing. So it's updated on the website now, updated on this slide. Casual volunteer may be 1 day, maybe over 1 day. So you'll see in that second column there, casual short-term. With the 1 day, no screening required. That first column is the background screening. With the over 1 day, screening is required. So Linda, does that look a little better, taking that piece out?
Mm-hmm.
It was confusing a lot. So you'll see the guidelines based on the categories. We have the casual, we have the enrolled. The enrolled long-term volunteer, there's no time you would be not screening the enrolled volunteer. That's why that's on that kind of grid. Screening is always required for the enrolled volunteer, and that screening is spelled out there in that chart. And then Linda mentioned the board of directors. I would say majority of, I know majority of associations. I think there's very few associations now whose board of directors haven't made the decision that they will always be screening their boards. But they do have the right not to. The board itself can say, nope, we're not going to screen the board members because of their connection with the County Law 224. So they're a little different than our volunteers because they actually provide oversight to the executive director. So they're a different class of volunteers. Screening's a little bit different, but once they vote as a board, then they would screen all of the board members. Once that board member steps out of its role and works as a 4-H club leader or helps out with an event more than 1 calendar year, they would automatically need to have that background check.
And just a clarification, there's a question in the chat box. As far as the motor vehicle record check, it doesn't matter if the volunteer is driving youth or driving adults or even just driving themselves. If they are driving during their work for Cooperative Extension as a volunteer, it's required of them, then they would need a background check or the motor vehicle check, right?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and that driving is tricky. We've spent a lot of time clarifying, and we can talk more about it if it's still a question, but it sounds like it's coming through.
Now, if they're driving themselves alone, the question is to activities off-site.
Okay, so if they're going to something that's not at the extension office, is that what I'm hearing? Activities
That's what it looks like, yeah.
So they're just transporting themselves, but if they're bringing people or carrying, maybe if they're there to, they need to pick up tables, bring that to another site, then that would be, when are they actually driving on behalf of the association?
And if they're driving an association vehicle, then obviously they would need to be motor vehicle checked.
Absolutely. Yep.
Can I just jump in here?
Oh, please do.
Quickly? Just to clarify, as I looked at the question, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, and I think it was Lexi who asked the question. Yeah. So if it's a group of adult volunteers going to the event and they just decided to carpool and go together to get there, that's not a required event. If, however, that volunteer was asked to transport 2, 3, 4 other adults to an event, to another site, then yes, you want an MVR. So, I mean, it's just like two or three employees carpooling to get somewhere. If it's not related to work, they're just carpooling to come into work or whatever. That's not the same thing as they're actually been asked or were instructed to or were requested to take the people. So that's a little different. So I just want to clarify that.
Thanks. That helps.
That's a good point. Okay. Let's see. So we don't really have time to get into all of these details. Did I jump ahead?
By a lot, but do you?
Oh, I did. How'd that happen?
I don't know. But do you just want to mention this?
I definitely will. This is the screen in the volunteer. It's a volunteer enrollment tool that's within the program development and reporting tool. This is part of the Business Systems Launchpad. So if any of you have done any reporting on behalf, contributed to the federal reports on behalf of your association, you know the tools in the Business Systems Launchpad. And this is one way, because we're talking about the volunteer managers are very, their time is limited. They always have lots of other jobs that go along with that, but there's some way you need to track these enrolled volunteers and who's been screened, or the casual volunteers, and how do I find that emergency number. And we just want to make sure you're aware, and this is another webinar beyond that hasn't been scheduled but has been offered in the past, how to use the volunteer enrollment tool. So it's a way of tracking those volunteers, and you can actually upload applications in here. You can track whether they're casual or enrolled. You can track when they were screened and print out a report of who needs screening. We ask that volunteers are screened at a minimum of every 3 years. So if you have a longer term volunteer, somebody who stays around for 3 years, which is very common in extension, you want to be sure those volunteers are on a schedule to be screened again. So that's something, if you're a new staff member, to go back and ask if this is happening. Double check your records. The 4-H Youth Development Program has, is it 4-H Online now?
Yeah.
I switch them back and forth. Has a very detailed volunteer database, but this is a way to track all of your volunteers. And I know Linda uses this also for her, all the volunteers in the association.
One thing it also helps with is for example, if a person comes to me and wants to start a 4-H club, I can look and see if they're already a volunteer in the association, and if they've already completed an application and all that kind of thing, such as if maybe they're already a Master Gardener volunteer. So it helps to not have to duplicate stuff like that.
Okay, great. Oh, so that's I skipped. Okay.
orientation. And so on the website, as Kim had noted when she showed you that, there is a box that tells you what needs to be included in an orientation. What we have here at my association is a general, about an hour, hour and a half orientation that's used with all volunteers. 4-H, Master Gardener, those are major ones here that are not the casual, but the enrolled. Okay, and these are the kinds of things that we go over. Really looking an orientation to Cornell, to our local association, to supports that we have, and to any other kinds of training that might be available. So it's good to have something that your source association can do for all of your enrolled volunteers.
And I'll just add that we're continually working to support this process. We're actually got a committee going. As I said, Celeste Carmichael was here earlier. She had to step out to another meeting, but she's been working on a master's degree and working with a group of us to help with this onboarding orientation process to Cornell Cooperative Extension. So not necessarily an orientation to the specific program, but the general orientation, including the risk management pieces. We're hoping to develop something with the help of volunteer managers around the state that is available online, and try out some tools. So this is a little bit easier for those of you who are managing volunteers. So stay tuned for that. We're actually looking at possibly some fall dates to get together and try out some of the resources that we've been playing around with. So I think that's very exciting.
It is. And the next slide basically runs through kind of what I just said with the what's required in mandatory and mandatory orientation. And then as you go to the next slide, shows how training is different, because the orientation is just helping people to feel a part of our organization, and so that they can speak a little bit about the breadth of our organization, and not only about the little part that they're involved in. And then we have training, which is really important because it helps our volunteers to feel like they are able to teach if they're going to be teaching, and they're using resources that the Cooperative Extension wants and expects them to use, and it prepares them to do the work that they're going to be doing for us.
And I think the other point is, again, those volunteers that stay around, these are refreshers, continuous training going on. So very good point there. So we weren't going to go into a lot of detail with these other pieces. I think I keep skipping.
There you go.
Apologize. So in your slides, if you downloaded the slide handout, I gave you the link to the course page on the staff site. You have the full slides that go into the utilization. And again, this is a little bit beyond the basics, but it is important to understand volunteers' abilities, their strengths, their weaknesses. Always have that ongoing communication, so you know they're not they're representing Cooperative Extension well, and being valuable educators, whatever the role happens to be, making sure that they're happy in their role and they're getting the challenge they need, but also getting the support that they need. So always being sure that that they're continually checking in, and we really want that if it's a long-term volunteer, making sure it's at least a once a year check-in feedback. It doesn't have to be a big detailed sit-down meeting with every single volunteer, but making sure you're in touch with understanding their performance and understanding their needs, making sure that they're connected to the organization. So important to have that at least once a year feedback of some type to those volunteers in your program that are continuing on, I should say. And then recognition, I think we do this very well, lots of different ways to recognize, but make sure you're, again, building it into your program. And evaluation is that E in Isature, again, the feedback, the annual evaluations, making sure you're providing the support that you need, and also evaluating when there are big events, big programs going on that volunteers are involved in, looking back and saying, were we as prepared as we needed to be for anything that came about, especially when there are some challenges. And again, we're going to talk more about that in the webinar on June 8th. Thinking through setting up those events, but also evaluating events to make sure we had thought of all the risk management implications and all of the learner, making sure it's a positive experience for learners. And I'll conclude. So we are close. We're over our time, and I apologize for that. Thanks for sticking in. If you need to leave, feel free to do that. But just in conclusion, the volunteer management system, we need to think about volunteers. And I know many associations have big success with this. It's not just bringing in a volunteer and putting them to work, but we want to make sure we have that full system to support them. They're our face out there in the community. We have over 45,000 volunteers when we talk about the casual and the long-term, there's a lot of volunteers out there, and they're wearing our shirts, and they're talking our talk, and they're making a difference in communities. And we want to be sure we've got that proper volunteer management system set up so that the programs are implemented well, the volunteers are supported well. And there will be challenges, but we also need to be sure that they know where to come when there's a challenge, and that we have ways to work through that. Help's available. So as we said, turn to your colleagues, talk in your association if you're very new, and find out what actually is happening, because sometimes that does take a little time to be familiar with what's going on, and ask the questions. Are we screening? How do we screen? Are we using First Advantage, which is not required, just one who does a minimum screening for us. We found this that works. There's other programs out there, other ways to screen volunteers, but we know that we want to have that minimum screen. Also making sure that you're tuning in, and I don't have to tell this group to seek professional development, and think about what you need as a new educator, or even as an experienced educator. Where could you develop your talents? So we want to be sure that there's resources out there. If there's something that you need, you're not seeing, tune in. We've got lots of opportunities that we don't really have time to talk about here, but ways to learn more about volunteer involvement for cooperative extension. So I really appreciate Linda and Jamie being on the line and being contributing. Jamie, you're always there for us, and I want people to know that the Wood office is great. Give them a call if you have questions or things that come up. And Linda's a wonderful educator who supports others, has trained a lot of new educators also, and really understands volunteer management. So I appreciate the chance to work together with both of you. The next slide is resources and references, but go ahead, Linda.
Well, I just want to mention, and just because I have done this a long time doesn't mean that I don't have issues with volunteer management. Do understand that a lot of times it's not necessarily you, it's a situation that happens, and I always look for support to work through any issues with Jamie and Kim.
Yeah, and we do that too. Talk to each other. We'll talk something out before we might give an answer, just to say, are we thinking about everything that's out there? Are we providing the proper support? And quite often there's new challenges every day, different challenges. So everything has a little slant to it, as Jamie knows, and we have to match it up with the policies and risk management that we need. So thank you for tuning in. Appreciate it. I hope you can join us for the Tender Care of the Challenging Volunteer. And also June 20th, we have the risks of summer in CCE that Jamie will be presenting. And that's always a great one to remember as we're sending our volunteers out into summer programs and fairs and parades. We'll tap into those resources too. So thanks for the comments. I appreciate that. Hopefully we got your questions. If not, we can you can send emails to me, to KFF2. You got my email today, or Linda's happy to answer questions also.
Great job, ladies.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody. See. Get to my recording.